Welcome to the Hot Politics Lab. I'm very happy today with our speaker, Jochem Tolsma, who works both at Radboud University and the University of Groningen. And he's a professor by special appointment of social divisions between groups. I had to think about that. At first, I thought you were specially appointed by social divisions between groups. But that's actually the topic of your research. Jochem also, so he works in Groningen at the Department of Sociology and the Department of Sociology at Radboud University. So that's also already some sort of division there. I'm curious to hear which university gets your better part. I
have one, yeah.
And so Jochem's recent research is very much about polarization. That's also the reason why we invited him. And since we spent so much time on getting set up, let's get started and give the floor to you. Questions, we'll have about 20-minute presentation and questions can be asked. And if you're online, you can ask questions to the Zoom portal. Cool.
Okay, well, thank you. Welcome, everyone. And thank you for having me. Quite curious to see what you're up to. So maybe that's for afterwards. Today, I will present some work in progress. So your inputs and your feedback is really welcome on this. The topic is political polarization and residential segregation. So let's get started. So what's the question? So what do I want to answer in this larger project? That's to what extent and why does residential segregation cause political polarization? So that's what I want. But hopefully I'll get there before I get my retirement. So we have to take a few steps back. And the question I want to answer now is to what extent, where, when, and how are residential segregation and political polarization related? Much more humble question, descriptive question about residential segregation and polarization. Okay, so why do I want to ask this question? Well, first, why is political polarization an interesting topic? So it really depends where I present stuff, what I need to explain or motivate, right? So here I need to motivate why we want to study political polarization, and maybe I need to motivate more why I want to connect this to residential segregation. If I do this for a demography group or for a sociology group, it's quite often the reverse. Well, we know that political polarization is a societal problem. People, pundits, politicians don't like polarization and attitudinal polarization. They think it can be a threat for democracy. And maybe falsehoods are harder to correct, etc. And political polarization can also be considered even as a part of a larger concept or phenomenon, namely social cohesion within society. And that's more or less why I came into this field. Why residential segregation? Once again, residential segregation is a societal problem by itself. People fear that can have negative impact on all kinds of things, for example, on polarization, and they want to circumvent that, and it can even increase inequality. Thank you. Okay. Then I label these social divisions between groups, and that's what I think the most serious problem we face nowadays. Okay, so two angles, polarization and segregation, and it also connects to literatures, namely the impact of living environment on voting behavior and the impact of living environments on social cohesion. So those two literatures I want to connect in this project. So what do these literatures say? Well, one of the literatures states that segregation along dimensions such as ethnicity, sex, age, religion, economic status, that would hamper intergroup contact. And because of that groups do not meet and mingle anymore. All kind of nasty stuff happens. At the same time, segregation, if groups are segregated in space, that would make them more visible, at least at the boundaries of these groups, and that would even increase feelings of threat, of group threat, and that could translate into attitudes, political opinions, for example, with respect to migration issues, and that could translate in voting behavior. So this is the literature, the political science literature, sociology literature, doing such kind of topics, although normally it's not really segregation as determinant in the models, but more group densities, I would say. Then there's another field, the agent-based modeling field, computational social science, where they investigate in a more formal computer simulation kind of way how segregation would impact influence dynamics. So how opinions would, how people, agents would influence one another, and how that depends on segregation. Well, I'm active in both of these literatures, and I want to connect them. The strange thing is that the link between the macro level phenomena has not been investigated before with empirical data. Naturally, there are some small exceptions, but in reality, we do not know how residential segregation is related to polarization or political polarization. And just to give a proof of that, I want to do a quiz with you guys. So in the end, I'll show a correlation. That's the end of my talk. We remain social scientists, but first, who can predict the correlation that I will show in the end? So who expects a positive correlation between segregation and polarization? Please raise your hands. More segregation in space, neighborhoods, communities. 1, 2, 3. Only 3? Yeah. Okay, 3. So 3 say there's a positive correlation. Who expects a negative correlation? 1, 2, 3 against 2. I thought that political science would be much more active. Activism. Who expects no correlation? Okay. 4, 5, and a lot of 6, a lot of indecisive. Okay, so 3, 2, 6. Yeah. So let's keep that in mind, those numbers. But just to be a bit more clear what we are talking about. We're talking about political polarization. Like you guys know, you can define this, the political polarization in numerous kind of ways. And we tried a lot of them in this project, but for now in this talk, I will focus on the variance in the pairwise opinion differences, defined as such. I think that's a quite intuitive way, so just variance, but then differences in how we all think, ranging between -1 and 1, and a distance to the center, where your opinion is compared to the mean or average opinion, and that's weighted by how large groups are. So for the second one, you actually need a priori groups, and in the first one, you don't need a definition of the group to begin with.
So variance within a certain area, or
I'll come back to that.
oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, but in essence, let's suppose in this room, everyone has an opinion, and then we can check for you what the distance between our opinions is. We do that between everyone, so all diets, so to say, and then the variance in that. Yeah. But I don't have individual data. What I have is data on polling stations. So I'm going to measure political polarization at the polling station level. And this is the political landscape. In the Netherlands, probably quite a familiar picture for you guys. This is just 2 dimensions, left, right dimension, conservative, progressive. These are all the 16 parties that participated in the latest election. And there may be way more parties, of course, but I don't have the political opinions for those parties. So we can order these parties in opinion space, so to say. But in each polling station, some parties receive more votes than others, receive less votes. So you could argue these are actual polling stations. So this is a polling station where polarization would be low. a lot of parties more or less clustered in the same opinion space attract the majority of the votes, and there are no really big parties with a large distance from that group of voters. This would actually be one of the most polarized polling stations, where we have parties in the left top corner and parties in the lower right corner, so to say. You can also imagine that there are quite a lot of different types of polling stations which show similar level of polarization, but a completely different voting outcome, right? So that's the nature of polarization. Okay, so if you do that for example, the Amsterdam, you would see here the level of polarization in Amsterdam. Not a lot of polarization going on, but what you do see is that polarization in the outskirts, if I may call it like that, or outside city center, is a lot larger than within the center. But what you also observe is that there is actually what we call spatial autocorrelation. So polling stations closer by look alike with respect to the level of polarization. Now I can switch between all kinds of stream, but now it's already dangerous enough with this setup, so I will leave that for later. Yeah. Okay, so that's dependent variable. Now we have another difficult concept, which is residential segregation or phenomena. And once again, there are numerous ways how to define it, how to measure it, along with social dimensions you can measure it. We are actually focusing on spatial measures of segregation, Moran's I, which is actually a correlation. So MI is my group membership alike to people around me, and am I more alike to people who are close by than to people further away? So that's a spatial correlation. But for this presentation, I focus on probably the best known measure of segregation, which is the index of dissimilarity, which can be interpreted as the percentage of people that should move in order to have the same distribution of people within space. And I do that within neighborhoods, and I use at the lower level 100 by 100 square meters with cells. So actually quite fine granular level to measure segregation. So think of parts of streets, right? Yeah. Then for Amsterdam, this would be the picture. I don't know. I do know it makes sense, but please think for yourself whether you think this makes sense. This is about ethnic segregation. For now, we only focus in two groups: people with parents born in the Netherlands and all other people. The white areas mean that there's only one group present, so you can't calculate the level of segregation. But yeah, what you also observe that once again that there is spatial correlation, right? But variance seems to be rather small. Okay, so that's the what. So now we know what we're talking about, what level we are measuring the stuff. How am I going to find or mine a correlation? Well, I'm going to do that in a theoretically informed, data-driven approach. Why? Because there are so many different choices you could make about how to measure those two core concepts that it's actually not straightforward where you need to look and which one would fit best with the theories. So it really is doing a lot of different things and see if we can observe, detect patterns and make sense of that. Okay. So the step one in our approach is to determine the catchment area of the polling stations. So from which area do the polling stations attract the voters, the vote base? And we use the Voronoi approach. This is the approach for Amsterdam. So a voter who would live near the red dots are polling stations, and people living to the closest red dot will vote there. That's our assumption. Now, immediately, I will get criticized for that assumption. For example, there was a polling station in the central station of Amsterdam where a lot of commuters voted, but we already deleted that from our sample, just as polling stations within universities, and we did that with some kind of boundaries or within 200 meters from a train station. We're not going to look at those polling stations, but still it remains an assumption. So, and then from each polling station, we know the composition. So we know how many people in that area live there with specific characteristics. We know the mean housing value, we know all kind of stuff for that area. And we could try to explain the level of polarization by the composition of the electorate. Yeah, so that's a composition effect, and that's a macro analysis, which has been done many times in the literature on voting behavior, predicting, for example, far right-wing voting, but naturally also be criticized that we actually want to do a micro analysis. Yeah, but for now, this is a macro analysis. And then we save the residuals. Yeah, so then we predict level of polarization in this polling station by the composition, but there's something left. Yeah, and that part that's left or unexplained part, that's the part we want to relate with segregation. Yeah. So then we determine the segregation as experienced by voters. And for now, we have the assumption that what kind of segregation do we experience? That's the segregation within their neighborhood, defined as the administrative neighborhoods. And a 100 by 100 subunit scale. But we tried all kinds of other stuff as well, and spatial measures, but that's not for now. So, and then we relate these residuals with the segregation from step one with this. Okay, but first have a look at the results. So this is an interactive plot. I may switch in the Q&A with the interactive one, right? But for now, these are just snapshots. So once again, this is Amsterdam. Right is the polling stations with the level of polarization, and left is the level of segregation on the neighborhood level. And you can now just eyeball what you see in results and if things make sense. So you could change the slider and see if you can observe patterns. And you could do that on all kinds of different scales, of course. So this is more or less the raw data, and this is what we're going to analyze in our models. And that's this. So first, we relate polarization by composition effect. For now, I only included the percentage of native Dutch in the analysis and the percentage of people on social benefits within a specific age range. So what do we see? We see that the more native Dutch, the less polarization, and the more people on social benefits, the more polarization on the two axes, right? In this case, so the left right axis and the progressive conservative axis. Now I'm going to save the residuals from this model. I'm going to put it in the other model to explain, to see if segregation is related to these measures. So first, if we do it in the uncontrolled model, we observe that both ethnic segregation and economic segregation is negatively related to polarization, so negative. But if we control for the level of composition, first up, we see that the variable is so more or less mediated. So it also shows that we need to take into account both composition effects and the effects of segregation. And then the final result would be that segregation along the ethnic dimension is negatively related to polarization, and along a socioeconomic dimension is positively related to segregation. With a disclaimer that effects are actually quite small. So they are significant, but on the scale that we have and the variance of the independent variables, I would say they are not that substantial, especially not if we compare it with the composition effects. Yeah. But it seems the group that didn't raise the hand lost out, and then the group that both predicted a positive and negative segregation both won, because we observed different dimensions and different correlation. Yeah, but I think the most people that could be most proud of themselves could be the ones that predicted the negative correlation, because the ethnic segregation was strongest. Thank you, Tom. Okay, so do we already have really conclusions that yes, we observe a negative correlation? No, not yet, because all kind of reasons that I listed on the next slide. But if we eyeball the level of segregation, if we eyeball the level of segregation and polarization, we do that city by city. We actually do see negative correlations, which we also saw in the second step without control, right? There we saw for both dimensions a negative correlation, which you also see by just eyeballing results. The funny thing is that those patterns may be completely reversed sometimes, right? So that you see that in some cities polarization occurs in the outskirts and in other cities within. So that's also interesting. So it also means we need to take into account way more control variables before we do our test again. So, thus eyeballing, we observe negative correlation. A first nationwide analysis shows a negative correlation for ethnic segregation and a positive for socioeconomic segregation. So, what's on the to-do list? Well, the to-do list is huge. We really need to improve our catchment area. And we could even move down from the polling station level to where our measure of polarization and disaggregate that measure and move down so we have polarization scores at a lower granular level. So, for example, at the 100 by 100 meter level in the Netherlands. Same holds true for the independent variables, because now we measure segregation. Now we assume that everyone who lives in the same neighborhood experiences the same level of segregation. We know that's not ideal already, so we need to use spatial segregation measures. But you can imagine that that's quite computationally heavy to calculate for the complete Netherlands. What about our analytical model? We already observed that there's not a lot of variance within Amsterdam, but if you would compare Amsterdam with other cities, that's of course a completely different story. So what would happen if you would do it city by city and then, for example, rank order the neighborhoods or the polling stations based on that level of polarization? So maybe that's how people vote and how they experience life, and how they translate that in voting behavior. So we want to see if segregation causes polarization. So we also want to include the temporal aspect. So we now at the moment cleaning the previous election results and then also matching them. So we have the temporal aspect in our polarization measure. And the list goes on and on and on and on. But I would love to hear from you guys if I forgot something on my to-do list or that I just could throw the complete project away. And that's it, more or less. Thank you. Oh yeah, and it's an open science project, so you can find all data code on my GitHub, and it's also a website. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll kind of moderate the questions in the room, and then Christian is online somewhere. He'll let me know if there's questions online, and then we'll read. Who's the first question?
Yeah, maybe I'm not really understanding what you've been doing. So then correct me if I'm wrong. But do I understand correctly, to measure segregation, you're looking at how different a certain region or a certain locality, the people who live there, how different they are from the rest, right? From the rest of the city. How many people would need to move to get the same distribution in terms of ethnicity or whatever as the rest of the city?
That's, in this case, it's not the city, but it's the administrative neighborhood level. So within your neighborhood, how many people should need to move in order that every 100 by 100 meter square part of your neighborhood has the same composition. So you're right, but then not at the municipality level, but at the neighborhood level.
Okay, so how many people would have to move from where?
From within a neighborhood.
From within a neighborhood to be similar to?
Other people in the streets 100 meters away. So for this
So how large is the neighborhood?
it depends. So some neighborhoods only have, say, 4 subunits. So for this measurement, you need to have a higher order unit and lower level unit. And some subunits have, some neighborhoods have like 1,000 subunits. Yeah.
But why would that be the basis for comparison? Why, if I'm doing an analysis of Amsterdam, why don't you say, I want to see how different, how ethnically diverse these subunits are, to compare them to the whole city? Why compare them to a few blocks away?
This is an argument about the scale at which you want to measure segregation, and this scale argument, which I explored in some other articles as well, you can actually split it up in 2. So what is a higher level? So would that be a neighborhood, or would that be a municipality? And the subunit. So is the subunit only 100 by 100 meters, or is that the neighborhood? And so you could also say, let's compare neighborhood composition with the total composition of the city. So this is an argument of scale, and this is exactly why I say this is a data-driven approach, because we vary both scales and look for patterns.
Okay.
And the theory is not that informative. So the theory would not say, if you want to predict far right-wing voting or polarization, we have an intuitive idea that segregation doesn't matter, but there's no one was saying you need to look at this scale. This measure also assumes that these units, the larger municipality unit and the neighborhood unit, actually also make sense for individuals, right? That they are aware of their boundaries of the administrative unit, which quite often they are not. So that's why we also use eagle-roots and go to different measures of segregation, where you would actually say, I live here, how similar am I to people around me? And then you need to define distance and proximity, and then you use a distance decay function and say, okay, Wouter is still important for me, but the people at the back, they are so far away, I don't care that I'm different than them. Yeah.
Okay, so at least I now understand how you measure segregation.
Yeah.
To measure polarization is so that's a variance, basically, as you showed on some formula of the variance.
Yeah.
Is that the variance within that same region of the
No.
people who live in that region, or is it the
Almost, it's the variance in the opinions of the people in the catchment area of each polling station. So
it's within that area?
well, actually, we have polling stations. So what we do, and we know for each polling station how many people voted for each party.
Okay.
To each party, we assigned opinions based on a lot of different sources. What I showed you here is the kieskompas, because I thought that would be most familiar to most people. But anyways, so we assigned the position of the parties back to voters, and then we calculated the level of polarization based on that.
Yeah. So my main point then is to measure segregation. You look at how different the group of people within a certain area are from whatever else. But to measure polarization, you measure the variance within the area.
Yes and no. But let's think about a voter. Yeah, let's think about one voter. A voter lives at some specific place. This voter experiences a level of segregation. Now, I define that now as the segregation within a neighborhood, but we use all kinds of different measures. That's what a voter experiences. Yeah. This would translate into the voting behavior of this specific voter. Yeah, but where would hopefully that's also of course. Yeah, but where does this specific voter vote in a specific polling station? Where? To the one that's most close to him or her. combined, if we aggregate all these voting results of these individual voters, that would lead to a level of polarization at the polling station level.
Yeah. Okay. So suppose there is an area where there are only people of one ethnic group living. In terms of segregation, you would say, okay, that area, that specific area is very segregated because it's very different from, suppose that other neighborhoods are composed of people of other ethnic groups. Then your measure of segregation would tell you that these people, this specific area is very segregated. Suppose the same people, they all vote for one party that would represent their specific group or identity.
Yes.
Then you would say, within that area, there is really no variance. So there's absolutely no polarization because they all vote for the same party.
Exactly. Yes.
So the baseline for measuring segregation is how different that area is compared to other areas, whereas to measure polarization, you measure it for within the area. How different, how large are the differences within the area? And I don't understand how the two are logically related.
The short answer is what you're saying, that's what I do.
Yeah.
That's the short answer. Yeah.
Okay. And now the question is, what's the logic? Why don't you, if you say, I think of polarization in terms of how different in opinions are the areas from opinions that people have in other areas, because that is how you define segregation.
Yeah, so both at the segregation level and at the polarization level, you could play with scale issue. That's absolutely true. But yeah, so that's true. But the idea is, what would we expect, right?
Yeah, so, but my expectation would be that if an area is very different in terms of ethnic composition or whatever from other areas, yes, that their voting behavior would also be very different from the voting behavior in other areas.
Yes, but that's exactly what I do. That's exactly what I do.
But you're saying that you're doing, for one, you're measuring the within variance, for the other, you're measuring the between variance in a way, to say it simply.
No, but that's not the case. So I have a neighborhood, I live on a specific street, that street is completely different than another street, segregation is high, you would expect that these people would vote differently. Yeah?
From other neighborhoods?
From other streets in this case.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. That's what I do.
Oh, okay, that's what you do. Okay.
Yeah.
We see that other.
Yeah.
We'll come back.
Yeah, so thank you very much. It's really interesting. I work with this data, but not in such a sophisticated way you can do. And we have all kinds of problems, the same issue, right? At the polling station, that is a problem. We must admit, right? Because we don't know whether people go to the polling station that's closest to them. And we also know that it's really different in Amsterdam where you live, right? So where I live in the center, I can select 10 rather close. If I live in the Belmer, where the turnout is low, it's very different. Right? So in that sense, yeah. But I do fully understand that you try to deal with this. I was a bit surprised to see the segregation map. So similar in the way Wouter explained it, but did I understand you correctly that you're, in this case, it's just about whether there are people with a migrant background compared to those without?
Yes.
So it's the people that either they themselves were born abroad or one of their parents.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter where you are.
Yeah, so I also, that's one of the things I say, okay, you have so many choices and opportunities, right? So you have a multi-group measures of segregation, you can have different definitions of groups. So for this presentation, I'm focused on, say, native Dutch, non-native Dutch. I also have, for this presentation, looked at non-Western versus not non-Western. So then you have the Western minorities compared with the native. That was all the same. But yes, definitely. So we are because we also know that in different cities, different ethnic compositions that are salient and may matter for voting behavior. Yeah. So to come back to your first point, if I may. Yeah. So what we did is we also checked the number of votes in each polling station and the number of inhabitants of the electorate in the catchment area, as we define it. And we try to optimize it. And if, for example, specific polling stations had a way higher turnout, then you actually know that this is a bad polling station for your analysis, right? And that gives us a tool to check the robustness of our results. So we could play with this threshold and then we could compare estimates and say, okay, they are unstable or not unstable. And we also did all kind of, and that's why we also go to a city by city analysis where you can actually say, for this part in the Netherlands, it's way more likely that the catchment area corresponds to how we construct it. Yeah. So we are fully aware, and I think we have quite some nice ideas how to tackle it, but still, yeah.
But then my final thing, so the study that I did in terms of voting patterns of people with a migrant background in Amsterdam and their turnout, qualitatively and also to some extent some more quantitatively, we do find that segregation plays a role in both. Especially the way that they experience themselves. So we did a lot of focus groups in Amsterdam recently, and it's really about inner city, inner ring or outer.
Yeah.
And of course, this is much broader than what you look at.
Yeah.
And I did not see that back in your way of measuring it. And that is really because you're focusing, that you just explained about so much onto whether your street or your small block of different components.
Yeah. Yeah, so given from the comments I received so far, then for this presentation, I should have picked a different one. But yes, but what we think is most flexible is go to an egohood perspective to say, okay, I live here in my environment defined as a circle around me with a radius of 1,000 meters, 2,000 meters. What's the level of segregation I would experience? And yes, yeah, and we can also take into account that will be quite difficult, but that would be ideal with travel distances, for example, because this is just as the crow flies, right? And if you do it on travel distances, then you can have even different, more sophisticated measures. Although I must say that in previous work, we did do a lot of data mining, so to say, and it didn't really matter that much. So if there's a real relationship, if segregation would really cause polarization, I expect it to show up even in a bad measure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. This is very interesting. I think this map is particularly nice to look at because it assumes people swim across the eye to go vote.
Yes, exactly.
So, and maybe you could take water into account, but I have a few separate questions. So one would be taking away some of these polling stations where a lot of people vote, like Central Station or here at the university. I'd say that would work if it was a random sample of people voting there. I'm not sure if that's the case.
No, that doesn't matter.
Well, why would it not matter? I mean,
it is not a random sample. That's exactly why I want to throw them away. So we know, for example, at the university is the higher educated people that go vote there.
Yeah, so it's about the lack of so suppose that all the people who would vote for GroenLinks would vote at the station because they're the only ones taking trains. Then we underestimate them in their polling stations.
Yes, yeah, that's true. That's true.
So that's a problem.
Yeah,
right?
that's a problem. No, that's a problem. Yeah, right. Yeah.
And the second thing was, what I was wondering is the problem of turnouts, because that also, I guess, seems to be a lot lower in highly segregated neighborhoods.
Yes, and yes, I think we've been thinking about that quite a lot. I don't know how to best theorize about that and how to deal with it. So what I think will happen, what I do know is that quite a lot of the polarization measures also could take that into account. So you could also assign some kind of neutral attitude to the non-voters, which is a bit problematic, of course. But you could also, for the polarization measure, I have to define relative proportions of each party. And I do that on the people that actually voted. Yeah, but I could also do that on the people that were supposed to vote there. And that is closest I could get to see if it would matter. But those are
Yeah. I don't put that in.
no. And yeah, so one of the other things that I want to do, because polarization is so difficult, I also want to compare the results, of course, with different dependent variables. So extreme right or far right and ethnic minority parties to see if you understand. Yeah.
Yeah, it is related to this question. I had a similar question. I was wondering, could you in some way make up for the fact that you underestimate maybe to some extent the segregated areas because many of the people maybe in the less segregated areas travel by train to the polling station by means of weights or something? And I have no idea how you could do
How
that.
do you travel by weight?
Yeah, well, yes, I have an idea. Now I'm going to do see if this works. So this is the whole Netherlands, right? That bad luck for them. So you can see, yeah, that's worse.
Depends on how many people.
There's 7 people.
Let's see if I swap. So now I hope that it will be visible. Okay, anyways, okay, then I can't show. The idea would be to select areas where you expect this would be not a huge case, right? So you now I don't know how can switch. Oh, here, yeah. So you could select areas or places or municipalities where you think this would be less of a problem. So this obviously is a big problem in Amsterdam and the surroundings. Maybe it's a less problem for Groningen or something, also university city, but a different travel area. So that's I think the way forward, and that's also what I say, city by city comparison.
Yeah.
And we also see quite a lot of different patterns in more rural areas as well. Yeah.
And would you use that information to design weights for this area then?
No, I think I would, I don't know yet, that's the honest answer, but I think that it may be possible to say, okay, we expect that this will take place in these parts or types of cities, and then just do a meta-analysis on the different results. Yeah, so something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. That was very interesting. I have a question about the implications of the findings. So you said that residential ethnic segregation negatively related to political polarization. But now I'm thinking like, I hope that shouldn't mean that we should have ethnically segregated neighborhoods.
Well, no, that's actually quite funny that you asked this, because I way back, I think that one of the early work that Tom and I did together, we observed something about a relationship, I don't know, ethnic composition and cohesion, and we also didn't find that. So we were invited to present those results at the municipality boards, and they were like, "Oh, so we should desegregate the city," and the other ones were like, "No, we need to segregate the city because of this." I don't know. I mean, it is actually quite a funny implication. Sometimes I must say that segregation is not always bad, right? So segregation is considered a societal problem, but it can be good for cohesion as well at a different level, and it also depends on the scale of segregation, yeah? And the other way around. Yeah.
So we should aim for moderate segregation. I mean, because like, well,
And
yeah, what do we do?
And polarization, yeah. No, well, yeah, well, here you would say more segregation would lead to less polarization, yeah, but naturally, if you go have a look at the polling stations, these polling stations, for example, will be polling stations where the far right had a large fan base, and polling stations where I think minority parties. So at that level, these polling stations are segregated, right? Yeah. What we do in different work is to think of computational experiments and see how segregation relates to polarization as well. And so we more or less use this to in the next step, or step 200 or so, to come to theoretical foundations, micro-level foundations, how segregation would impact influence processes.
What is the societal relevance?
But it's knowing how segregation would impact opinion dynamics, right?
Yeah.
Knowing whether or not, if you bring groups together or not, whether or not that would lead to polarization or to consensus. And then it's up to politicians to see that there's probably going to be a trade-off between segregation and polarization. Then it's up to politicians to say, okay, we want to balance it such or such, right? But at least we need to know how it works.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, okay, no, I hope I wasn't too offensive, but I mean, this is a very good question, yeah.
And we have two more questions, Daniel and then Gijs, if there's time. Yeah.
Yeah, just one one little remark on the last point. But that would also depend on which level you compare, right? So you can have very segregated neighborhoods where within those neighborhoods there's no polarization at all, but you could end up with a highly polarized national level of polarization, right? So I think it would really make sense to also compare that different scales.
Of course, yes, you're absolutely right. So very nice that you pointed out again, because this is exactly why we started the project. We want to see what are the patterns of segregation and polarization. And the question is, at what level do we observe them? And it could very well be that those patterns are reversed at a lower scale and at a higher scale. Yeah, so this is exactly what we want to do, and see if we could tell you guys, hey, look, at this level we find this, at this level we find that. Are there different mechanisms at play at individual level, or is it simply an aggregation problem? But first we need to discover these patterns, right? Now we don't know. Yeah.
Gijs,
Tom, I will use my question to the boss.
yeah.
Thanks. Two questions. First, the literature that you yourself have been quite a big part of has shown nonlinear effects. I think particularly in step 1, but probably also in step 2. Did you check for those?
I was glad that I was able to put these tables here. No, not yet. No, not yet. No.
Because there are these stepping stones after which you can find different effects. Secondly, European variable polarization is of course based on the party system. And we know that the Dutch party system is basically broken down in 3 subgroups at the voter level.
Guys know, I'm a sociologist.
We've got voters for the left-wing parties, for center-right, and for the radical right. You can play around with that, I guess, in your dependent variable to assess to what extent your findings show increased polarization or decreased polarization, depending on how you frame your hypothesis, within the blocks or between the blocks.
Yes.
I guess a lot will be driven by between block differences, but nevertheless, you want to know what's going on. It might be simply D66 that doesn't fit any of those that drives the effect, or it might be the difference between DENK and PvdA within the left-wing block. Or
I completely agree that it's on the to-do list. So it's more or less, okay, what has the highest priority at the moment, right? So where do we start to improve theoretically, methodologically? So I think it's more or less the same problem that you addressed. If you find no polarization, you don't know what's happening, right? So it could be radical right, it could be a minority party, and now we lump them all together. So we need to play around with that. Yeah. So either a typology of different outcomes are polarized in this way within blocks, between blocks. We could also define the polarization measured by itself to assigning opinion scores of the blocks. So not 16 groups, but three groups. Yeah, all kind of different things to do. Yeah. So yeah, for me now, I think that the first step to see if we are actually doing something is go to one specific party, and that would be extreme right, I guess, because that's the largest literature, and I've done some stuff on that myself, and see if it makes sense, and then go to more complicated dependent variables. Yeah.
Okay, we decided to go a little bit over time because we also started a little bit later. So that leaves some time for my question.
That's why we decided.
So you asked us whether about a causal effect.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering about the causal reasoning here, because as I understand it, these are all things we're observing at the same time.
Now, right. Yeah. So we have both the residential data and the voting data at different time points.
Okay, so that's the eventual goal then, to
Yeah.
look at the difference in one of them being caused by the change.
Yeah. And they had a crucial assumption, because there's only 2 time points still.
Okay.
The crucial assumption is that opinions change faster than residential mobility, right? So that's, you could all argue against it as a review number 2 probably, but this is the next step. So first, a difference by difference correlation, but maybe it goes one way. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, Wouter and I basically got that reviewer 2 years ago. Who basically referred to American literature saying, well, because of polarization, people start to segregate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So it's not a
I wouldn't say that's
unlikely statement.
no, it's not unlikely. I think it's way more likely in the US than in the Netherlands.
Sure.
And maybe there are ways to account for that. So we don't know yet at the moment. So we know, for example, how many people moved in these residential areas. So you could also say, okay, I'm only going to select areas where people don't move. Yeah. So yeah, but this is really on the lower part of the to-do list.
Yeah, just speculating a little bit about this. I guess that the type of houses there should really matter, whether these are social housing projects where there's not a lot of mobility or ownership.
Yes.
Particularly thinking my own neighborhood now, but it's interesting because it's a highly segregated area, but all the PVV voters, white, they've all left and have all been replaced by green left voters.
Okay, yeah.
Driving electric cars.
It's segregated again, but in a different.
I don't think anything changed in terms of segregation. But it's changed in terms
The
of
voting outcomes.
Yeah.
So if that would be like halfway the process, right? So then we would observe a lot of polarization, right? Yeah. So that's also refers to this part, right? So this is the composition part, and we have way more variables here, of course. So housing values, types of houses, distances to all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, then it's time to wrap up. Thanks a lot, Jochem, for actually coming here, which was a little bit of a surprise to me, but it was great to actually meet you physically, because I can now also, I think you're one of the one of the first speakers in a long time that I can actually visibly give you the hot politics lab coffee. Coffee will never taste the same again.
No.
If that's good or bad, I don't know. Thanks a lot for your talk. It was really great having you. Quite a different perspective than what we normally have. The word emotion that wasn't mentioned today. Nice change for once. For the next few weeks, we actually continue quite a bit on the theme of polarization. So next week, November 18th, we have a speaker who will definitely not be here because he's at the University of Arizona. He has to wake up, I think, at 5 in order to give this talk. Frank Gonzalez is his name. He will talk about inhibition or ideology, the neural mechanisms of racial pride and politics. So we get to look at brains. After looking at Amsterdam, we get to look at brains. Then the week after, we have Graduate Friday, where Christian People and Maaike Homan will present their work. And then the last meeting of this year is with Kristin Scholz from the Amsterdam School for Communication Research. And her talk is called Neuromechanisms of Polarization and Information Spread. So you're always welcome to join us. I think we'll have a little beer after this. Hopefully you'll join us there, and we'll be down in the cave. So if you want to join. Oh yeah, thanks to the sponsors.
Right, Dennis?